Welcome to Pod for Israel, and we're continuing our talk with my friend, my dear brother, Dr. Seth Postell, about his book, The Art of Narrative Analogy. And Seth, I want you to go deeper and give us some more examples of these amazing analogies from the Old and the New Testament.
With pleasure, Golan.
So I want to put you on the spot. You ready?
Yes.
If you had to choose your favorite biblical analogy, the New Testament, the Old Testament, if you had to choose one that you can share with us, what would it be?
Wow. That's a hard question. I don't have a particular one that's favorite. I think they're all my favorite, but I could say that one of my favorite analogies actually shows and highlights the grace of God is in the Gospel of John. You have back-to-back stories. Nicodemus is a religious leader who is he's a teacher of Israel that everybody respects him, and he meets Jesus in the dead of night, and he has no clue what's going on, right? But the very next story, you've got a Samaritan woman, she's unnamed, who meets Jesus in the middle of the day, not in the middle of the night, in the middle of the day. Why the middle of the day?
But why do you emphasize Samaritan? What's the problem, Samaritan woman?
She's, they were rejected. They were second class. They were third class.
And she was a woman.
But she was a woman, but she also had how many husbands? Several husbands. And so you realize that this woman meets Jesus in the middle of the day. She has clearly no religious training. She's living a very loose life. She's rejected by her own people. That's why she goes to draw water in the middle of the day. And the way that John presents her, he presents her as an analogy, a reverse analogy to Nicodemus. She's everything that Nicodemus is not. He's a named teacher. She's an unnamed, rejected person. He's a man. She's a woman. He's respected. She's practically a prostitute.
Nevertheless, he comes at night.
And he hides. She has nothing to hide. But what ends up happening is you realize by virtue of this analogy that she sees the identity of Jesus very clearly. She sees what Israel's greatest teacher doesn't see. And as a result, she leads her entire village to faith. And so by virtue of this inverse analogy, you realize that, the prologue says Jesus came to his own received him not, but to them that received him, to them he gave the authority to become the children of God. And here we see the beautiful grace of God, the Samaritan woman, whom, we would despise her, we would reject her, this loose woman, and yet John glorifies her as an incredible example and as a model of what God's grace looks like in adoption, and the fact that you don't need to be a rocket scientist, you don't need to have 20 PhDs to recognize Jesus. And he does that by way of analogy.
Here's another question. What's the difference between a narrative analogy and typology? Because I hear that word a lot, typology. Is it the same thing?
No, it's absolutely not the same thing. In the book, I talk about it. So typology tends to be a bit allegorical, not always, but it looks for parallels. It just looks for correspondences in history, and then it presumes that God has, a divine meaning in those parallels, which may or may not be, but it can't be defended.
So if I'm saying that the Song of Songs is a love song between the Messiah and the church, that is a typology?
Well, yeah, because how would you... The question then becomes, did the author of the book, the historical author, intend that or not? And so in a narrative analogy, you're not looking for what God may have possibly meant by parallels. You're actually finding concrete examples when one author reuses an earlier narrative in order to tell us something. And so narrative analogy is looking to understand the literal meaning of the text. And what I find to be very exciting, at least as a follower of Messiah, is that oftentimes by noticing these analogies, my excitement for the New Testament grows. My conviction that Yeshua is the promised Messiah grows.
Okay, so now we have to talk about, the suffering servant and Isaiah 53, because that's a good example. Also, for the way the Bible interprets itself, and I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible. I'm not even talking about the New Testament. So how can we figure out the identity of the suffering servant from a narrative analogy perspective?
Yeah, again, one of the things, and one of the things I hope to convince people with the book, is that narrative analogy is actually very critical for a defense of our faith, right? To see that the Old Testament authors, the authors of the Hebrew Bible, were reading the Hebrew Bible much like the apostles. They were interpreting the Hebrew Bible much like the apostles. And so what do I mean by that? So if we consider Isaiah 53 comes in the context of Isaiah's New Exodus, Isaiah chapter 40 through 55. Why do we call it Isaiah's New Exodus? Because you can see that Isaiah is describing Israel's future redemption by borrowing elements from the story of the first Exodus.
Clear language.
He's reusing Exodus imagery, Exodus vocabulary, Exodus plot sequence to tell about a future Exodus. Now, why is that important? Because Isaiah 53 is kind of it's the climax of Isaiah's new Exodus, where Israel finally recognizes that the one that they've rejected is the servant of the Lord. They believe in him and they are redeemed. That's exactly like the ending of the Exodus, when finally, when Moses is first sent to Israel in chapter 3 and chapter 4 of Exodus, they're not going to believe me. They're not going to believe me. They're not going to believe me. And you see that they struggle, they wrestle, they doubt, they complain. But by the end of the Exodus, God exalts Moses so that what? That the people of Israel believe in the Lord and in his servant Moses. In other words, the moment I recognize the analogy, the fact that Isaiah is leaning on the story of Exodus, I don't have to wonder if Isaiah 53 is about the nation of Israel or about the Messiah. The analogy proves that Isaiah 53 has to be messianic.
But we are taught, in Israel, in the Jewish world, we are taught that the suffering servant is the nation of Israel, is the group of people. How can we, is there a narrative analogy? Can we prove by a biblical interpretation of itself that the suffering servant is a person and not a nation?
Well, again, by virtue of the fact that Isaiah is he's paralleling the servant of the Lord with Moses. That's number one. But it is interesting you should ask, because in Jeremiah chapter 11, verses 18 through 20.
So wait, Jeremiah that comes at least 100 years after Isaiah?
Jeremiah comes after Isaiah, and he actually cites Isaiah 53, verses 7 and 8, and he identifies with the servant of the Lord. And so we can actually see that by reusing another passage, Jeremiah proves to us that the prophets understood Isaiah 53 as referring to an individual and not as the entire nation. So again, learning the tools to understand when an author cites earlier passages is a critical skill, not just for understanding the New Testament, but also for defending our faith.
Okay, now you said skill, and I wanted to ask you something about that. So identifying narrative and narrative analogy, is that only for, Top Gun experts that know only they know biblical Hebrew, they know the Greek, or is it for most of us?
So I wrote the book in order to help people who love the Bible to see these analogies and to learn how to interpret them. So I didn't write to Bible scholars. I know that the book will be helpful for people that are involved with biblical scholarship, but the book is as simple as it can possibly be. It does not require the reader's ability in the biblical languages. You don't have to know Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew to read the book. And I am hoping that the book is clear enough and simple enough and well explained enough that anybody that loves God's word and gets really excited about parallel passages and understands how important they are will be able to read that book and apply the principles for themselves.
And you say that people can identify narrative analogies even without knowing the original language?
Correct. So the analogy itself requires that the connection is based in the original languages. But in the book, I explain and I provide and I point to all the different tools that Bible readers have at their disposal. I think we have to realize that today we live in the modern age. We live in the age of the internet. We live in the age of Bible software. We live in the age of lexicons. And we've got so many tools that at our disposal that anybody can actually not only notice when there are two parallel stories, but even can check it in the original languages without knowing the original languages.
This tool of narrative analogy, why is it so important, especially in the context of witnessing to our Jewish people?
Yeah, so what's really common, and I hear this all the time, people kind of, they love to use typology to prove that the Old Testament is about Jesus. And what I mean by typology is kind of a mystical reading the New Testament back onto the Old Testament. And so you see these parallels and you read it back, but you're not interested in what the original authors intended or meant. So I don't care if Moses meant that the tabernacle is a messianic figure. I don't care if, the author of the Torah, Moses, meant to present himself as a messianic figure, but I'm going to read things back. What I know about Jesus in the New Testament, I read back onto the Old Testament. It's not a very convincing way to, our people don't accept the authority of the New Testament as the Word of God. It's reading backwards. The beautiful thing about narrative analogy is that you're actually being very sensitive to the intent of the historical authors, and you start to realize that the way that they're reading the past and interpreting the past to understand their present and also to prepare us for the future, you start to realize that they literally are reading these stories like the New Testament authors. And so that the prophet like Moses really is messianic. Isaiah chapter 11, when it talks about this regathering of all nations, right? And the crossing of the sea. And in the end of, I think it's chapter 11, verse 16, the sea is split, they cross over. And then in chapter 12, they're singing this song, behold, God is my salvation. Well, where have we seen that before? We've seen that in the story of Exodus, right? The new Moses, the new song of redemption. But why is that important? Suddenly we realize that Isaiah, he himself understood Moses as a messianic figure. I don't need the New Testament to realize that Moses is a messianic figure. I need the Old Testament. I need the Hebrew Bible so that when the New Testament presents Jesus as a new Moses, we already see he's a messianic figure because we see how Isaiah is interpreting the life of Moses. We see how Joshua is interpreting the life of Moses. So I think the point is by narrative analogy actually helps us to become better students of the Word of God, more appreciative of the way the New Testament authors present Jesus, and it also equips us to better defend our faith.
Yeah, because in Israel, when I talk to Israelis, religious Israelis, secular, sometimes the New Testament authors have a bad rap of misquoting the Old Testament or taking verses out of context. But you're saying that this tool and finding narrative analogies helps to prove otherwise. And in your research, you found that the New Testament authors were actually understanding authentically the meaning, the authentic meaning of the Old Testament, right?
So my PhD mentor, John Selhammer, he used to say, we'll never understand and appreciate the New Testament's interpretation of the Old Testament until we start to see the Old Testament's interpretation of the Old Testament. This entire book is trying to help believers realize that the Hebrew Bible is not just text, it's text and commentary. And when we start to notice the commentary on the text, we realize that the Hebrew Bible's commentary on itself looks virtually identical, if not the same, to the New Testament's commentary on the Hebrew Bible. And again, it gives us a greater appreciation for the meaning of the New Testament.
Yeah, by the way, I think Paul is getting some of the heat for allegedly taking verses out of context, and I think it's the last thing you can say about Paul that he's taking. I think Paul understood the Torah really well, right?
Correct. And that's, again, my book is trying to, in that sense, I'm trying to argue and to show that the New Testament authors were very, very sensitive to the parallel stories and parallel passages in the Hebrew Bible.
Now, almost the final question, but I got to ask you, what's a predictive analogy, and can you give an example? What do you mean by predictive analogy?
Yeah, so you have narrative analogies. So sometimes narrative analogies, the point is just to kind of help us understand, poetic justice. So for instance, Jacob, right? He tricks his father's blindness. He dresses up like his older brother to steal the blessing. And so you wonder, okay, does the ends justify the means? Well, you find out he's going to get a payback because later on, Laban is going to, he's going to use the older daughter. She's going to pretend to be the younger daughter. He's not going to be able to see. It's the middle of the night, and he's going to wake up in the morning with the older daughter rather than the younger daughter.
He got what he deserved. Huh?
It's a reversal. So the parallel there is poetic justice. In other words, yes, Jacob was supposed to get the blessing, but the way he did it by deceiving his father is not right, and so he's going to reap what he sows, okay? A predictive analogy is actually those instances when an author refers to an earlier story, but he does so in order to foresee or to predict the future. So for instance, in Zechariah chapter 12, in Zechariah 14, when he describes the return of the Messiah, the Lord, it says, to the Mount of Olives to fight for his people. Well, where else do we see the Lord fighting for his people? It's in Exodus 14. And as a result, it's very interesting that when he steps on the Mount of Olives splits in two. The people pass through the heart, the center, to be redeemed. So it's a new Exodus. And so what we see is that's a predictive analogy. In other words, Zechariah is reading the story of Exodus not as what once was, or merely as what once was, but what will be. And by the way, that's exactly what you see in the book of Revelation. So John is reading also the Exodus and the plagues and the Lamb and the Song of Moses. He's also seeing the past as a picture of what will be. So that's predictive analogy.
Yes, so that was from you mentioned the book of Revelation. Can you give us another example from the Old Testament?
Yeah, the book of Daniel is a very interesting one. So the story of Daniel, being tried and tested and triumphant and interpreting the king's dream. Who does that remind you of?
Joseph.
That's Joseph. So he's a Joseph-like figure, but he's a little bit different than Joseph in chapter 2 in the sense that, yes, he interprets the king's dream, and he's rewarded like Joseph, but there's another element in the story. The king falls down and worships him, and he offers him incense, and you think, wait a minute, how can Daniel be worshipped, right? He's a man. And then Daniel he promotes his three friends over the government of Babylon, and you think, wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, that then becomes a predictive analogy to the story of one like a son of man in chapter 7. So in chapter 7, you have all the nations that fall down and worship one like a son of man, and then one like a son of man gives the rule to the saints. And so what's interesting is within the book of Daniel, Daniel becomes a Joseph-like messianic figure that anticipates one like a son of man. And so by predictive analogy, we actually see that Joseph is a messianic figure. He's interpreted messianically.
Yeah. Thank you, Seth. This was certainly an eye-opener. Thank you for your time. And again, if you want the book, we have a link in the description. And I'm telling you, it's going to change the way you read the Bible. May God bless you, and may God enrich the way you understand His Word.